The thermometer read -42 degrees on the morning of January 9, 1841, when Absalom Finch crawled through 2 feet of snow to reach what his neighbors had been calling Corrigan's Badger Hole for the past 2 years. Inside the root cave shelter, Thaddeus Corrigan sat comfortably in his shirt sleeves beside a fire no larger than a cooking flame, while outside the worst blizzard in Michigan Territory history was killing families in their own cabins. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier wisdom speak to you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale reveals an innovation even more unbelievable than this one. The cabin Thaddeus Corrigan and Lemuel Stowe built in the autumn of 1838 was entirely adequate by frontier standards. It stood on a slight rise 3 miles west of the Kalamazoo River in what would eventually become southwestern Michigan, though at the time it was simply wilderness with scattered settlements and ambitious names. The structure measured 16 feet by 20 feet, built from oak logs, notched at the corners in the saddle joint style that most settlers used because it was fast and required no specialized tools beyond an axe and an auger. They had chinked the gaps between logs with a mixture of clay and moss gathered from the riverbank, pressed into place during a warm October week when the material was still pliable. The door was solid pine planks held together with cross bracing. The roof was split shakes overlapped in layers across pole rafters. By the standards of 1838 Michigan Territory, it was good work. Thaddeus was 32 years old that autumn, lean and weathered from 6 years on the frontier. He had come west from Pennsylvania in 1832 with basic carpentry skills learned from his father and enough money saved to purchase land rights and supplies. Lemuel was 41, a widower from Ohio who had joined Thaddeus the previous spring after his own farm failed. They had formed an easy partnership based on complementary skills and mutual respect. Lemuel was better with an axe. Thaddeus was better with planning and measurement. Together they had cleared 3 acres, planted a late crop of corn that yielded modestly, and built the cabin in 11 days of steady work. The cabin had a fieldstone fireplace that Thaddeus had built with particular care, having learned masonry basics during a winter spent working construction in Detroit. The chimney drew well. The hearth was deep enough to hold substantial logs. They had harvested and split 6 cords of firewood during November, stacking it against the cabin's north wall under a bark-shingled lean-to that kept the wood dry. 6 cords seemed adequate for a winter. Most of their neighbors used 4 to 5 cords in a typical season. Winter came early that year. Snow fell in mid-November and never fully melted. By December, the ground was frozen, solid. The men settled into winter routine. Thaddeus maintained their trapline, checking for beaver and muskrat in the unfrozen sections of nearby creeks. Lemuel processed the pelts and managed the cabin, keeping the fire going and preparing meals. They took turns with night watch, waking every few hours to add wood to the fire. The cabin stayed tolerably warm, though frost formed on the interior walls near the chinking gaps on the coldest nights. They considered this normal. Every cabin had drafts. Every settler woke to feed fires. The cold was simply part of frontier life, and the cabin they had built was as good as anyone else's in the territory. The cold snap began on January 14, 1839, with a wind shift that brought Arctic air sweeping down from Canada across the Great Lakes. Temperatures dropped from 20 degrees to 0 in less than 6 hours. By nightfall, it was -15. By midnight, -25. The wind howled through the forest, finding every gap in every structure, turning cabins into sieves that bled heat faster than fires could generate it. Thaddeus had left at dawn on the 14th to check his trapline, a circuit that normally took 6 hours. The traps were set along Portage Creek, 4 miles north of the cabin through dense hardwood forest. He wore every layer he owned: wool undershirt, flannel overshirt, leather vest, wool coat, and a beaver fur hat Lemuel had made from their previous season's catch. He carried his rifle, a small pack with fire-starting materials, dried venison, and a hatchet. The temperature drop caught him 2 hours into his walk. The wind picked up suddenly, and within minutes the cold became aggressive, biting through his layers with shocking intensity. He checked 3 traps, found them empty, and made the decision to turn back immediately. His experience on the frontier had taught him to respect sudden weather changes. He walked fast, not quite running, but moving with purpose, watching for signs of frostbite on his exposed hands. He reached the cabin at dusk, 4 hours after starting his return journey. The walk that normally took 2 hours had taken 4 because he had stopped twice to build small fires to warm his hands and feet, a necessary delay that likely saved his extremities. He was exhausted, dangerously cold despite his continuous movement, and deeply grateful to see the cabin ahead with smoke rising from the chimney. He pushed open the door, expecting warmth, and found death instead. Lemuel was lying on his sleeping platform against the far wall, covered with both their blankets, motionless. The fire had gone out completely. The interior of the cabin was barely warmer than the outside air. Thaddeus dropped his pack and went to his partner, already knowing from the stillness what he would find. Lemuel was dead, frozen solid, his face peaceful, but his fingers curled and rigid. The fire pit held only cold ashes. Thaddeus rebuilt the fire with shaking hands, his mind unable to process what had happened. Lemuel was experienced. He knew how to maintain a fire, but as warmth slowly returned to the cabin and Thaddeus's thinking cleared, he began to understand. The extreme cold had overwhelmed their shelter. Even with a fire burning continuously, the cabin would have struggled to maintain survivable temperature. At some point, probably in the early morning hours, Lemuel had fallen asleep. The fire had burned down. In a well-insulated structure, the retained heat might have been enough. In their cabin, with its chinked gaps and single-layer log walls, the cold had flooded in within an hour. Thaddeus spent that night sitting beside the fire, feeding it constantly, keeping it larger than necessary, watching the flames and thinking about the gaps between the logs where frost glittered in the firelight. The temperature outside dropped to -32 degrees that night, the coldest reading anyone in the territory would record. Inside the cabin, even with the fire roaring, Thaddeus could see his breath. He buried Lemuel 3 days later when the cold finally broke enough to make digging possible. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep. It took him 6 hours to excavate a grave on a hillside overlooking the river. He marked it with stones and spoke no words. There was nothing to say that the cold had not already made clear. Spring arrived in late March 1839, melting the snow and revealing a landscape Thaddeus barely recognized. He had spent the remainder of winter alone in the cabin, maintaining fires with obsessive vigilance, sleeping in brief intervals, and filling a journal with observations about cold, heat loss, and structural failure. The cabin that had seemed adequate now felt like a trap he was fortunate to escape. He began traveling in April, visiting settlements within a 20-mile radius. At each stop he asked the same questions. How cold did your cabin get during the January freeze? How much firewood did you burn? Did anyone nearly freeze? The answers formed a pattern. Every traditional log cabin had struggled. Families had huddled together for shared warmth. Several children had suffered frostbite. One elderly woman in a settlement near Schoolcraft had died, her cabin's fire unable to overcome the cold penetrating through the chinked gaps. In May, Thaddeus visited an Ottawa village 15 miles north of his homestead. He had traded with these families before and was received politely. He asked about their winter shelters. An elder named Mockery walked him through their construction methods. Their winter lodges were partially underground, banked with earth on the sides, with multiple layers of bark and hide covering the framework. Mockery explained that earth stays warm beneath the frost line, that banking with soil stops wind, that small spaces hold heat better than large ones. Thaddeus spent 3 days at the village, studying their structures, understanding principles he had Never considered, white settlers built UP, creating maximum interior space. The Ottawa built down and small, creating efficient spaces that required minimal heat. The difference was philosophical. One approach valued size and visibility. The other valued thermal efficiency and fuel conservation. He began studying animal dens with the same intensity. He found a bear hibernation cave in a hillside, noting how the earth around it remained unfrozen even in deep winter. He excavated an abandoned badger burrow, measuring its dimensions and observing how the tunnel design prevented wind penetration while maintaining air circulation. He watched foxes disappearing into ground dens and emerging hours later, their fur dry and body heat maintained without any fire at all. His neighbors thought he was losing his mind. Hiram Jessup, who owned land adjoining Thaddeus's claim, mentioned his concerns to others at the trading post. Orrin Blackwood, another nearby settler, suggested that Lemuel's death had broken something in Thaddeus's thinking. Deacon Reuben Whitlock from the Methodist congregation visited in June, expressing gentle concern about Thaddeus's mental state and suggesting that proper Christian grief did not involve digging up animal holes. Thaddeus accepted their concern politely and continued his research. He was not grieving improperly. He was solving a problem. Lemuel had died because their shelter failed. The solution was not better firewood management or thicker blankets. The solution was fundamentally rethinking what shelter meant on a frontier where winter cold could kill in hours. By late June, his journal contained 40 pages of observations, measurements, and calculations. He knew what he needed to find. Thaddeus found the tree on July 2, 1839, while scouting for a new homestead location. He had decided to abandon the cabin he had shared with Lemuel, unable to spend another winter in the structure that had failed to protect his partner. He was exploring a tract 2 miles southwest of his original claim, looking for high ground with access to water and sufficient cleared space for crops. The oak had fallen recently, probably during a severe thunderstorm the previous August. The trunk was massive, nearly 4 feet in diameter, and the root ball was extraordinary. When the tree toppled, it had ripped an enormous mass of roots and soil from the ground, creating a vertical wall of earth and wood that stood 8 feet high and stretched 15 feet across. The roots extended outward in a tangled network, thick as a man's leg near the trunk, tapering to finger width at their extremities. Thaddeus approached the root mass and immediately noticed the cavity beneath it. Where the roots had lifted from the earth, they had created a natural shelter, a space hollowed out by the tree's own weight and structure. He knelt down and crawled underneath, finding himself in a cave-like space approximately 6 feet deep and 10 feet wide. At its broadest point, the earthen floor was dry despite recent rains, the soil packed hard and level. Above him, the underside of the root system formed a natural ceiling, dense and interwoven. He sat there in the dimness, noting how much cooler the space felt compared to the summer heat outside. The temperature difference was immediately noticeable, perhaps 15 degrees cooler. His mind made the connection instantly. If the Earth maintained cooler temperatures in summer, it would maintain warmer temperatures in winter. The principle worked both directions. He spent 3 days at the site, returning each morning with tools and measuring equipment. He brought candles to examine the root structure in detail, checking for rot or weakness. The oak had been healthy when it fell. The roots were solid, showing no signs of decay. He measured the cavity dimensions, calculating how much additional excavation would be needed to create adequate living space. He tested the soil composition, finding it dense clay mixed with loam, stable, and unlikely to collapse. On the 3rd day, he brought his journal and sat beneath the roots for 6 hours, sketching plans and working through structural problems. The roots provided a natural roof that would support enormous weight. The earth walls would provide insulation superior to any log construction. The small space would require minimal fire for heating. Every principle he had learned over the past months pointed to the same conclusion. This fallen tree offered everything a frontier shelter needed, already created by nature, requiring only intelligent adaptation. He claimed the land tract that week, filing paperwork at the territorial office in Kalamazoo. By mid-July, he had moved his tools and supplies to the site. Construction began on July 20th. His neighbors heard about his plan within days. The mockery started immediately. The excavation required 9 weeks of continuous labor. Thaddeus began by carefully removing soil from beneath and around the root ball, working with a shovel and pickaxe to expand the natural cavity into a proper living space. Every shovelful was deliberate. The root mass weighed several tons, and disturbing the wrong structural elements could cause collapse. He studied the root pattern for 3 days before removing any earth, identifying which roots bore weight and which were merely anchoring tendrils. He dug inward and downward, creating a space 12 feet wide, 10 feet deep, and 7 feet high at the center. The ceiling height tapered toward the edges where the root mass curved downward, but the central area provided adequate headroom. He removed approximately 40 cubic yards of soil over 6 weeks, hauling it out in a wooden wheelbarrow he had built specifically for the task. The excavated soil he used to create a sloped embankment leading to the entrance, ensuring water would drain away from the shelter. Where roots crossed his planned living space, he left them in place, incorporating them into the structure. Several thick roots became natural shelving supports. Others he trimmed carefully, sealing the cuts with pine tar to prevent rot. The root ceiling remained largely intact, a dense network that would distribute weight across multiple connection points rather than relying on any single structural element. The drainage system was critical. Thaddeus dug a perimeter trench inside the shelter, 6 inches deep and 4 inches wide, sloping toward the entrance. He filled this trench with river stones graded by size, largest at the bottom, creating a French drain that would channel any water seepage toward the exit. Over this, he laid a bed of gravel across the entire floor, tamping it firm and level. The entrance required 2 weeks of work. He harvested young elm saplings, each approximately 3 inches in diameter, and steamed them over fire until they became pliable. He bent them into arched shapes and planted them in the earth on either side of the entrance, creating a curved framework. He wove thinner branches between these arches horizontally, forming a lattice that he reinforced with rawhide bindings. The result was a sturdy arched entrance 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, large enough to crawl through but small enough to minimize heat loss. Hiram Jessup visited in late August with Orrin Blackwood. They stood watching Thaddeus work, shaking their heads. Hiram said it looked like a grave being dug from the inside. Orrin said, "No Christian man should live like a beast in a burrow." They told him he was wasting prime building season, that he could have constructed a proper cabin in the time he had spent digging. Thaddeus thanked them for their concern and continued working. By September 1st, the excavation was complete. He began installing the floor covering, unrolling heavy canvas he had purchased in Kalamazoo for $12, an expense his neighbors considered wasteful luxury for a hole in the ground. The canvas floor covering was the most expensive single element of the entire shelter, costing more than Thaddeus had spent on tools, nails, and all other materials combined. He had purchased 20 yards of heavy-grade canvas, the type used for wagon covers and military tents, treated with linseed oil for water resistance. His neighbors considered it absurd to put such material on the floor of an underground shelter. Thaddeus understood what they did not. The canvas created a critical barrier between his body and the earth, trapping an insulating air layer while preventing ground moisture from reaching his living space. He laid the canvas in overlapping sections, tacking the edges to wooden stakes driven into the earthen walls. Where sections joined, he created 18-inch overlaps sealed with additional linseed oil. The result was a continuous floor surface that was flexible enough to conform to minor ground irregularities, but tough enough to withstand years of foot traffic. He tested it by pouring water on the surface. The water beaded and ran toward the drainage channels without penetrating. The fireplace construction took 12 days. He gathered flat stones from the river, selecting pieces that fit together with minimal gaps. He built the firebox in the shelter's northwest corner, creating a chamber 18 inches deep, 24 inches wide, and 20 inches high. Small dimensions were intentional. A compact firebox required less fuel and generated heat more efficiently than large, open fires. He built the chimney from stones mortared with clay, angling it upward through the root mass at a carefully calculated pitch that would create proper draft without allowing rain to enter freely. The ventilation system was his most innovative element. He had observed how Ottawa lodges maintained fresh air without losing heat, using multiple small openings rather than single large vents. He installed 3 hollow logs, each 6 inches in diameter, angled upward through different sections of the root mass. These pipes extended to the surface, creating passive air circulation. Warm air rose through the chimney, drawing fresh air through the ventilation logs. The system was self-regulating, requiring no mechanical operation. Interior organization consumed the final 2 weeks of September. He carved shelves directly into the earthen walls, creating niches for supplies, tools, and personal items. He built a sleeping platform from split logs, raised 18 inches above the floor and positioned along the eastern wall where the root ceiling was highest. Beneath the platform, he created storage space for his remaining supplies from the previous cabin. Deacon Reuben Whitlock visited on September 28th, bringing another attempt at intervention. He stood at the entrance, refusing to crawl inside, and spoke about human dignity and proper Christian living. He suggested that Thaddeus's choice to live underground reflected spiritual darkness that required prayer and community support. Thaddeus listened politely and explained the thermal properties of earth insulation. The deacon left confused and concerned. By October 1st, 1839, Thaddeus moved into the root cave permanently. He brought his remaining possessions, arranged his living space, and lit the first fire in his stone fireplace. The shelter was complete. The mockery intensified immediately. The first snow fell on November 8, 1839, 3 weeks earlier than the previous year. Thaddeus watched it accumulate on the root mass above his shelter, each inch adding insulation value he had calculated but never tested. Within 2 days, 8 inches covered the entire structure. The temperature inside his shelter remained steady at 52 degrees with no fire burning. He lit a small fire that evening, more for cooking than warmth, and watched the interior temperature rise to 65 degrees within an hour. The fire consumed 3 small logs over 4 hours before burning to coals. December brought sustained cold. Temperatures outside dropped to 0 and stayed there for a week. Thaddeus maintained a fire each evening for 2 hours, letting it burn out overnight. He woke each morning to interior temperatures around 50 degrees, cool enough to see his breath, but nowhere near dangerous. He dressed, relit the fire for breakfast, and began his day. His firewood consumption was astonishing in its efficiency. Where his previous cabin had required half a cord per week during cold snaps, the root cave required 1/10 that amount. The physics worked exactly as he had calculated. Earth below the frost line maintained constant temperature regardless of surface conditions. His shelter, buried partially underground and insulated by root mass and snow, tapped into that stability. The small interior volume meant minimal air to heat. The canvas floor prevented ground cold from penetrating upward. The compact fireplace generated heat efficiently, and the earthen walls absorbed and radiated that heat slowly, maintaining warmth long after the fire died. Word spread through the scattered settlements. Jasper Kinney, a 26-year-old settler who had claimed land the previous spring, visited in late December out of genuine curiosity rather than mockery. He was struggling in his own cabin, burning through firewood at an alarming rate, and still waking to frost on his interior walls. Thaddeus welcomed him, explained the principles, showed him the construction details. Jasper sat in the shelter for an hour, feeling the stable warmth, noting the minimal fire, understanding intellectually what he was experiencing, but finding it difficult to reconcile with everything he believed about shelter and survival. Jasper asked practical questions. How did Thaddeus prevent moisture buildup? The ventilation logs and proper drainage? How did he prevent smoke accumulation? The angled chimney and compact firebox created sufficient draft. What about structural stability? The root mass was solid wood supporting distributed weight, far stronger than any roof humans could build. Jasper left thoughtful, but uncommitted. The idea of abandoning traditional cabin construction for underground living remained too radical despite the obvious evidence. January 1840 brought another severe cold snap, temperatures dropping to -25 degrees for 3 consecutive nights. Thaddeus remained comfortable throughout, his small fires maintaining interior warmth, while his neighbors burned enormous quantities of wood and still suffered. Hiram Jessup lost 2 chickens to cold, despite keeping them inside his cabin. Orrin Blackwood developed frostbite on 3 fingers while splitting firewood in desperate midnight efforts to keep his family warm. The winter passed. Thaddeus survived it easily, but most settlers attributed his success to luck, mild weather, or simple tolerance for discomfort rather than superior engineering. The winter of 1840 into 1841 started mild, with temperatures hovering near freezing through December and early January. Settlers relaxed, grateful for the easy conditions after several brutal years. Then on January 6, 1841, the barometric pressure began dropping. Thaddeus noticed it first as a dull headache, then as unusual animal behavior. Deer moved nervously through the forest. Birds disappeared. The air felt heavy and expectant. The storm arrived on January 7th with light snow and dropping temperatures. By evening, the wind picked up, howling through the forest with sustained force that bent trees and created drifts within hours. Temperature dropped 10 degrees overnight. By morning of January 8th, it was -15 degrees with wind chill, making it feel like -40. The snow continued falling, thick and heavy, accumulating at a rate of 2 inches per hour. January 9th brought conditions unprecedented in territorial memory. The temperature at dawn was -38 degrees. By noon it had dropped to -42. The wind never stopped, creating whiteout conditions where visibility disappeared beyond 10 feet. Snow accumulated to depths of 4 feet in level areas and 8 feet in drifts. The storm was not moving, locked in place by atmospheric conditions that meteorologists decades later would identify as a polar vortex, though no one in 1841 had terminology for what they were experiencing. Traditional cabins faced catastrophic failure. The sustained wind found every gap in chinking, every crack around doors and windows, turning structures into wind tunnels that bled heat faster than fires could generate it. Settlers burned through firewood supplies at 4 times normal rates. Families huddled together under every blanket they owned, keeping fires roaring continuously, and still the cold penetrated. Frost formed on interior walls inches thick. Water buckets froze solid inside cabins within hours of being brought from wells. Absalom Finch lived 3 miles east of Thaddeus with his wife and 2 young children. His cabin was well built by standard measures, constructed just 18 months earlier with careful attention to chinking and a good stone fireplace. On the evening of January 8th, with his firewood supply running dangerously low and the cold overwhelming his shelter despite continuous fire, his chimney caught fire. The creosote buildup from days of maximum burning ignited, sending flames shooting from the chimney top. Absalom made the terrible choice to let it burn out rather than risk the fire spreading to his roof. But the intense heat cracked his chimney stones. By morning of January 9th, his chimney was unusable, smoke filling his cabin whenever he tried to light a fire. He took his family to his nearest neighbor, Hiram Jessup, a mile away through chest-deep snow. Jessup's cabin now held 9 people in 16 by 20 feet of space. They kept the fire, enormous burning furniture when firewood ran low. The cabin stayed barely survivable, temperatures inside struggling to reach 40 degrees despite their desperate efforts. By January 10th, the fourth day of the storm, multiple families faced similar crises. Firewood supplies depleted, structures failing, cold penetrating despite maximum efforts. People were dying, not from exposure outside, but from cold inside their own shelters. Absalom Finch left Hiram Jessup's overcrowded cabin on the morning of January 10th, desperate and half-frozen. 9 people in one small space had created warmth through shared body heat, but Jessup's firewood was nearly gone, and the cold was winning. Absalom remembered hearing about Corrigan's underground shelter 2 miles southwest. He had never visited it, had in fact joined others in mocking the idea, but now he had no alternatives. His family would die if he did not find help. He traveled through snow that reached his chest in places, following a creek he knew led toward Corrigan's location. The journey took 3 hours and nearly killed him. He arrived at the site disoriented, seeing only snow-covered forest, until he noticed the entrance, a small dark opening in what appeared to be a snowdrift over a massive root structure. He crawled through, expecting cold refuge, and found warmth instead. Thaddeus sat beside a fire the size of a cooking flame, wearing a single wool shirt, comfortable. The interior temperature was approximately 65 degrees. Absalom collapsed just inside the entrance, shaking violently, unable to speak. Thaddeus pulled him fully inside, removed his frozen outer layers, wrapped him in a wool blanket, and gave him hot broth from a pot hanging over the small fire. Absalom sat for 20 minutes before he could form words. When he finally spoke, his questions came in disbelief. How was this possible? How could such a small fire create this warmth? Thaddeus explained while preparing food. Earth insulation, root mass overhead, snow providing additional barrier, small space requiring minimal heat. Absalom listened, understanding intellectually but emotionally unable to reconcile the warmth he felt with the primitive appearance of the shelter. He stayed that night. The storm continued outside, wind howling, temperature dropping further. Inside the root cave, Thaddeus let the fire burn down to coals after sunset. The temperature dropped slightly but stabilized around 55 degrees. They slept comfortably under single blankets. Absalom woke several times, disoriented by the absence of cold he had been fighting for 4 days. Jasper Kinney arrived the next morning, having heard from Jessup where Absalom had gone. Then Hiram Jessup himself came, bringing his wife and children, swallowing pride to seek shelter he had mocked for 2 years. Orrin Blackwood arrived by afternoon. The root cave, designed for 1 man, now held 8 people. Thaddeus accommodated them all, rationing his food, supplies, maintaining the small fire, explaining the principles to people who finally had motivation to listen. They stayed 3 days while the storm continued. The shelter never became uncomfortable despite the crowding. Body heat from 8 people actually reduced fire requirements. Thaddeus burned less wood with 8 occupants than he normally used alone. The physics of small insulated spaces worked in his favor. On January 13th, the storm finally broke. Temperature rose to 0, which felt tropical after 6 days of extreme cold. The families returned to their damaged homes. No one mocked Thaddeus Corrigan again. The man who lived in a hole had saved their lives. Spring of 1841 arrived late, snow lingering into April. When it finally melted, the damage from the January blizzard became visible. 3 cabins in the region had been abandoned, their owners either dead or relocated. 7 chimneys required complete rebuilding. Firewood supplies throughout the territory were depleted to levels that would take years to replenish. The blizzard of 41, as it became known, had killed 14 people in southwestern Michigan territory alone, most dying from cold inside their own shelters. Jasper Kinney approached Thaddeus in May with specific questions. He had found a fallen elm on his property with a substantial root ball. Could the technique work with elm instead of oak? How deep should he excavate? What about water drainage in lower elevation sites? Thaddeus answered every question, offered to help with the initial excavation, provided measurements and principles. By June, Jasper was digging. By October, he had completed his own root cave shelter. Absalom Finch abandoned his damaged cabin entirely. He found a massive maple root system on higher ground and spent the summer of 1841 creating his version of the design. He added refinements Thaddeus had not considered, including a double-layer canvas floor with sawdust insulation between layers. The technique was spreading, not through promotion or formal instruction, but through organic adoption by people who had learned its value through near-death experience. Over the next 5 years, variations of root cave construction appeared throughout Michigan Territory and into Wisconsin. Trappers built them in remote locations where traditional cabins were impractical. Hunters created seasonal shelters using the principles. Settlers in isolated areas adopted the technique for winter survival. The phrase, "warm as Corrigan's Cave," entered regional vocabulary, used to describe any space that maintained comfortable temperature with minimal heating. Thaddeus continued living in his root cave through the 1840s. He married Elizabeth Harding in 1847, a schoolteacher from Kalamazoo. She appreciated the engineering behind the shelter, but preferred something with windows and standing room. Thaddeus built her a small timber frame house on the same property, using money saved from years of minimal firewood expenses. They raised 2 children there. He maintained the root cave for storage and occasional use, sleeping there during hunting trips and keeping supplies secure from weather and animals. By the 1850s, frontier settlement guides occasionally mentioned earth-sheltered construction, usually without attribution. The technique never became dominant. Traditional cabins still far outnumbered underground shelters, but it persisted in areas where winter survival required maximum efficiency with minimum resources. Thaddeus Corrigan died on March 3, 1869, at age 63, from pneumonia contracted during a late winter cold snap. He was buried beside Lemuel Stowe on the hillside overlooking the Kalamazoo River. His root cave shelter remained structurally sound, used by subsequent property owners for storage until the 1880s. When it was finally abandoned, the root system continued holding the earth in place, a testament to engineering that worked with nature rather than against it. The man who solved winter's deadliest problem with a hole in the ground left no monuments except the lives he saved and the technique he shared freely with anyone willing to listen.